It is the morning of March 22nd, 1621. The snow is still clinging to the tree line. The settlement is half built, half alive, and then, without warning, a stranger walks in from the tree line, raises his hand, and says two words that will change the course of American history.
Good morning.
Welcome, Englishmen. Half of them are already in the ground. The ones still standing are gaunt, hollow-cheeked, wrapped in whatever wool and linen survived 66 days at sea. They have been clinging to this coastline for 4 months, and every single morning, someone has not woken up. This is Plymouth Colony, winter of 1620 to 1621, and this is the story that gets scrubbed clean every November, dressed up in buckles and turkey, and served to school children as something warm and uncomplicated. It wasn't. Not even close. This is what actually happened. You have to go back further, back to England, not 1620, but 1607. A congregation of radical separatists in the village of Scrooby, Nottinghamshire, is falling apart. These are people who believe the Church of England is irredeemably corrupt, who have been fined, harassed, and imprisoned for refusing to worship inside it. Their leader, William Brewster, has already been jailed. Young William Bradford, 20 years old, brilliant, stubborn, and deeply devout, watches his community crack under the pressure and makes a decision. They flee to the Dutch city of Leiden, where they spend over a decade in relative peace. But peace has a price. Their children are growing up Dutch. Their congregation is aging, and somewhere in their collective imagination there is a different idea forming, a wilderness entirely their own. By 1620, the plan is set. A group of London merchants called the Merchant Adventurers will finance the voyage in exchange for 7 years of labor from the colonists, fishing, hunting, trading furs. The settlers will load onto 2 ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower, and cross the Atlantic to settle near the Hudson River, where their charter technically authorizes them to plant. What could go wrong? Almost everything, as it turned out. The Speedwell leaked, then leaked again. Then a third time, so badly that she had to be abandoned at Plymouth Harbour, England. Historians later concluded that her crew had likely sabotaged her on purpose. They simply did not want to cross the Atlantic. More than 20 extra passengers were crammed onto the Mayflower in their place, pushing her total to 102 souls. On September 16, 1620, already dangerously late in the season, she set sail alone into the grey Atlantic. She was a merchant vessel, not a passenger ship. Her between-decks space was roughly 5 feet high, her cargo hold dark and wet and perpetually cold. That is where most families lived for 66 days, in near darkness, on a diet of salt meat, dried biscuit and water that turned foul, a detail almost nobody tells you. Only one passenger died on the crossing, a young manservant named William Button. The sole crew member who did not survive? The sailor who had spent the voyage mocking the seasick passengers, cursing them, and telling them he looked forward to throwing their bodies overboard. He fell ill mid-ocean and was gone before they reached land. The pilgrims wrote it down. They believed quite specifically that God had answered them. The Mayflower dropped anchor off Cape Cod on November 9, 1620. This was already wrong. Their charter covered the Hudson River 250 miles south. Attempts to push south were beaten back by violent shoals and winter seas. So they stayed, which meant their legal authority to govern themselves had dissolved the moment they arrived. On November 11th, before anyone stepped ashore, 41 men gathered in the ship's great cabin and signed what we now call the Mayflower Compact, a document of raw, improvised democracy binding all passengers to obey laws they would collectively create. It became the template for every self-governing community that followed in New England, and its fingerprints are on the American Constitution itself. For 5 weeks, scouting parties waded through freezing marshes in soaked wool boots, probing the coastline for somewhere to plant. On one of those scouting missions, they dug up buried caches of seed corn, stored by the local Nauset people for the winter. They took it. They kept a record of what they had taken, intending to repay it later. Whether they ever fully did remains a matter of historical dispute. They also found something else. Bones. Lying in the open, on the beach, picked clean, still where they had fallen. Plymouth Colony was not being built on empty wilderness. It was being built on the ruins of Patuxet, a Wampanoag village that had been completely obliterated between 1616 and 1619 by an epidemic so catastrophic that some estimates suggest 90% of the coastal New England indigenous population was gone within 3 years. The most current historical research points to viral hepatitis carried ashore by European fishermen. The colonists, arriving on a cleared freshwater site with no current inhabitants, saw the hand of God preparing a place for them. The ground told a different story. They anchored in Plymouth Harbor on December 16th. Construction of a common house began on Christmas Day. The separatists did not celebrate Christmas, so they worked. While the building went up, most colonists stayed aboard the Mayflower, rowing ashore and back in freezing weather. That was the mistake that cost so many their lives. The combination of 66 days on a salt-heavy sea diet, cold exposure, and now wet conditions in an inadequately heated ship destroyed immune systems already run to the edge. Scurvy, pneumonia, and what contemporary records call the general sickness moved through the passengers with terrifying efficiency. January took 8 lives. February took 17 in a single month. Among the fallen were Rose Standish, wife of the colony's military captain Miles Standish. Dorothy Bradford, William Bradford's wife, had already drowned in December, slipping from the deck of the Mayflower while she was anchored in Cape Cod Harbor. Her body was never recovered. Bradford wrote almost nothing about it. Historians have speculated ever since whether it was accident or despair. By the time the snow began to melt in late March, 45 of the original 102 were gone. 78% of all married women who had crossed on the Mayflower did not survive that first winter. Only 7 of the 19 planned houses had been built. The few still healthy enough to stand spent their days nursing the others, and then walking to Coles Hill above the harbor to dig graves. They deliberately leveled those graves. They planted over them, smoothed the hillside flat, scattered brush across the mounds. Because they were being watched from the tree line. And they did not want the watching Wampanoag to know how many of them had fallen. Which brings us back to that March morning and the stranger at the edge of the settlement. His name was Somerset, a Wabanaki leader who had learned passable English from fishermen trading along the Maine coast. He walked in calmly, asked for beer, accepted some hardtack and butter instead, and spent the night talking. Days later, he returned, and with him came a man whose life story is, in every measurable sense, more remarkable than the entire Pilgrim saga. Tisquantum. Squanto. He was born in Patuxet, the very ground the colonists were now standing on. In 1614, he was among 24 Wampanoag people lured aboard an English ship by a captain named Thomas Hunt, locked below deck, and transported to Malaga, Spain, to be sold into the slave trade. Somehow, and the historical record is genuinely unclear on the how, he escaped, made his way to London, learned fluent English while living in the household of a merchant named John Slaney in Cornhill, and returned to North America in 1619 aboard a trading expedition. He came home to find his entire village gone. Every person he had ever known, his family, his neighbors, his entire people, had been erased by the epidemic while he was overseas. He was, as far as anyone could determine, the last Patuxet alive. He had been spared the plague specifically because an Englishman had kidnapped him. He then chose to help the English colony survive. He showed the settlers how to plant corn in the sandy New England soil using dried fish as fertilizer, a technique so effective their harvest that autumn exceeded anything they had expected. He taught them which plants were edible, where the eels ran, how to read a coastline they didn't know. He brokered the formal peace treaty between Governor John Carver and the Wampanoag leader Massasoit, a treaty that held, with remarkable stability, for 50 years. The relationship was not simple, and Tisquantum himself was no innocent. Later records show him playing the colonists and the Wampanoag against each other, attempting to build his own power base, angering both sides. He died of fever in November 1622, bleeding from the nose on a trading mission with William Bradford, asking the governor to pray that he might go to the Englishman's God in heaven. In October 1621, before any of that unraveling had begun, the harvest came in. It was better than it had any right to be. The colonists fired their muskets into the air in celebration. Massasoit heard the guns from 40 miles away and arrived with 90 Wampanoag men and 5 deer. For 3 days they ate outside, together, venison, wild fowl, shellfish, corn, wild plums, chestnuts. Of the 50 colonists at that table, only 4 were adult women. The men and children who remained had outlasted something almost unsurvivable. They gave thanks. They were right to. Everything that followed, the Mayflower Compact's ideas spreading through town halls and state constitutions, the self-governing ethic taking root and growing into something unprecedented in the modern world, traces a line back to that frozen December arrival, to that terrible winter, to bones on a beach and a man who came home to find only ghosts and helped anyway. The graves under Coles Hill are still there. Plymouth Harbor still opens to the same cold Atlantic. And somewhere in the American idea of community, of law made by the people who live under it, the echo of those 52 survivors is still audible, if you know how to listen. If you watched this to the end, you already know what History Recreated is about. Not the clean version. The real one, with all its grief, its impossible coincidences, and its quietly staggering consequences. Subscribe to History Recreated, leave a comment telling us which moment hit you hardest, and tell us which chapter of history you want us to reconstruct next. The past doesn't need myth. It's extraordinary enough on its own.